Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American South. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1838, along the coastal lowlands of Georgia, approximately 18 miles southwest of Savannah, a series of events unfolded at Meridian Oaks Plantation that would challenge every notion of human depravity and psychological endurance. The case, documented through an extraordinary collection of journals, legal depositions, and ecclesiastical records, presents a portrait of horror made all the more disturbing by the meticulous nature of its recording. The region itself demands understanding before we proceed into the darkness that consumed one family and rippled outward to touch dozens of lives. Coastal Georgia in the 1830s represented the height of the plantation economy, where vast estates stretched across thousands of acres of fertile land fed by the slow-moving tributaries of the Ogeechee River. The landscape was one of extreme beauty and equally extreme isolation. Ancient live oaks, draped with Spanish moss, created cathedral-like canopies over roads that could become impassable during the frequent rains. Between the grand plantations lay miles of swampland, pine barrens, and bottomland hardwood forests, where the boundary between civilization and wilderness remained perpetually contested. Meridian Oaks itself covered approximately 2,300 acres, with the main house situated on a slight elevation that provided views across rice fields to the south and cotton fields to the north and west. The plantation had been established in 1791 by the Harwick family, passing through 3 generations before coming into the possession of Augustus Nathaniel Harwick in 1835. The property included not only the main residence, but also a complex of outbuildings, quarters for the enslaved population numbering approximately 140 souls, a sugar house, a rice mill, and most significantly for our narrative, a private chapel constructed in 1806. This chapel, built of tabby concrete mixed with crushed oyster shells in the traditional coastal Georgia method, stood approximately 100 yards from the main house along a moss-draped avenue. It measured 30 feet in length and 20 feet in width, with narrow windows of colored glass imported from Charleston and a bell tower that rose another 15 feet above the pitched roof. The interior featured pews carved from heart pine and a small altar area separated from the main worship space by a turned balustrade. Behind this balustrade, in what should have been a vestry, lay a locked room measuring approximately 10 feet square. It was in this room that Catherine Meridian Harwick would spend countless hours over 3 years recording events that defied moral comprehension. Augustus Nathaniel Harwick arrived in Georgia in 1834 at the age of 32, having spent the previous decade in Haiti and Cuba managing sugar operations for British commercial interests. His background before the Caribbean years remained deliberately obscure, though records from the port of Savannah indicate he possessed letters of introduction from merchants in Liverpool and Kingston. He was described in the Savannah Georgian of March 1835 as a man of considerable height, perhaps 6 feet and 3 inches, with dark hair worn longer than fashion dictated and eyes of such pale blue they appeared almost colorless in certain light. His education was evident in his speech and bearing, Yet there existed about him what one contemporary observer called an unsettling quality of watchfulness, as though he were perpetually studying those around him for purposes known only to himself. Catherine Meridian Lowell came from an entirely different world. The youngest daughter of Reverend James Meridian Lowell of Charleston, she had been educated at the Mrs. Grimball's School for Young Ladies, and was known for her skill at watercolor painting and her beautiful penmanship. She was 23 years old when she married Augustus Harwick in April 1835, a union arranged through family connections and motivated, according to letters preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society, by her family's financial difficulties following her father's death. The marriage took place at St. Michael's Church in Charleston with all the appropriate ceremony, and Catherine arrived at Meridian Oaks as its new mistress in May of that year. For the first 18 months, by all accounts, the plantation operated within the normal parameters of such establishments in that time and place. Catherine's letters to her sister in Charleston, preserved and later donated to the University of Georgia archives, describe the routines of managing a large household, the challenges of the climate, and her gradual adjustment to plantation life. She wrote of her husband with careful formality, noting his dedication to improving the property's productivity and his intensive study of agricultural treatises. She mentioned that Augustus often worked late into the night in his study, and had begun maintaining extensive journals of his observations and experiments. The first indication that something had shifted came in a letter dated November 1836. Catherine wrote to her sister, "Augustus has undertaken a new philosophical inquiry that occupies him most completely. He has asked that I assist him in maintaining records of his studies, as my hand is clearer than his own. I confess I do not fully understand the nature of these investigations, but he assures me they are of the utmost scientific importance." What Catherine could not know, or perhaps could not allow herself to fully acknowledge at that early stage, was that her husband's philosophical inquiries had taken a turn toward territory that existed far beyond the boundaries of legitimate scientific study. Augustus Harwick had become obsessed with what he termed the mechanics of absolute human degradation and the documentation of psychological dissolution. He had begun to view the enslaved population of Meridian Oaks not as human beings, but as subjects for experiments that drew from his readings in mesmerism, phrenology, and certain esoteric texts he had acquired during his years in the Caribbean. The chapel became central to these activities in early 1837. Augustus ordered the installation of a substantial lock on the door to the rear vestry room and had heavy curtains hung over the room's single small window. He commissioned the construction of a large writing desk, specially designed with compartments for journals and a surface that could be adjusted to various angles. Most disturbingly, he had iron rings installed at various points along the walls, ostensibly for hanging lamps, but serving purposes that would become horrifyingly clear. It was in March 1837 that Augustus informed Catherine of her new duty. According to her later testimony, given in 1841 to a grand jury in Savannah, he explained that he required a scribe of intelligence and education to document his work. The records needed to be precise, objective, and complete. Catherine's initial resistance was overcome through a combination of psychological manipulation and explicit threats. Augustus made clear that her family's financial dependence on him was absolute, that her sister's children's education was funded through his generosity, and that any refusal would result in consequences extending far beyond herself. More troubling still was the philosophical framework Augustus constructed to justify Catherine's participation. He argued that the documentation itself represented a higher form of moral witnessing, that by recording these events with clinical precision, she was creating a testament that would ultimately serve the cause of human knowledge. He convinced her, through hours of intense discussion that witnesses later described as a form of intellectual mesmerism, that her role as recorder made her separate from the acts themselves, a mere instrument of scientific observation. The journals that Catherine was forced to maintain, 63 volumes discovered in 1841, represent one of the most disturbing documentary collections in American history. Written in her distinctive copperplate hand, they describe with devastating clarity a progression of experiments that began with psychological torment and escalated over 3 years into acts of calculated brutality. What makes these documents particularly harrowing is their tone, clinical and precise, as Augustus insisted that Catherine maintain absolute objectivity in her recording. The earliest entries describe what Augustus termed observational studies. He would bring individuals from the enslaved population to the chapel vestry, usually in the evening hours, and conduct extended interviews while Catherine transcribed his questions and their responses. He asked about their dreams, their fears, their memories of Africa or of family members sold away, their understanding of their own condition. He would note their physical responses, the dilation of pupils, changes in breathing, signs of trembling or perspiration. A journal entry from April 1837 demonstrates the methodical nature of these early sessions. Catherine wrote, "Subject number 4, male, approximately 28 years of age, field hand, 3rd generation. Questioned regarding memories of mother, sold to Alabama Plantation 1829. Subject exhibited marked physiological response including increased respiratory rate and visible trembling of extremities. Master noted particular interest in the precise moment when psychological resistance appeared to collapse, estimating this occurred at the 7-minute mark of sustained questioning. By summer of 1837, the experiments had evolved. Augustus began introducing what he called stimulus variations, deliberately invoking terror through various means, while Catherine documented the progressive stages of psychological breakdown. He would have subjects restrained while he described in elaborate detail punishments he might inflict, never actually carrying them out in those early months, but studying the anticipatory fear with scientific fascination. Catherine's journals record pulse rates, patterns of pleading, the precise words spoken, the physical manifestations of extreme distress. What perhaps makes Catherine's position most psychologically complex was that Augustus ensured she understood the alternative. On several occasions, he explicitly stated that her meticulous documentation was preventing worse outcomes, that her presence and recording served as a restraining influence on his impulses. Whether this represented genuine truth or merely another layer of psychological manipulation designed to secure her complicity remains one of the ambiguities that scholars would debate for generations. The situation at Meridian Oaks did not remain entirely hidden from the outside world. Though the isolation of the plantation and the rigid social structures of the antebellum South created barriers to intervention. Reverend Samuel Wickham, rector of Christ Church in Savannah, made a pastoral visit to Meridian Oaks in September 1837. His diary, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society collections, records his impressions with growing unease. Wickham wrote, "I found Mr. Harwick to be a man of considerable learning, but possessed of a manner that I can only describe as unsettling in its intensity. He spoke at length about his studies of the human mind and the importance of systematic observation in advancing knowledge. When I inquired about the spiritual welfare of his household, both family and enslaved, he assured me that he conducted regular services in the Plantation Chapel. Mrs. Harwick appeared in good health, but remarkably subdued. When I attempted to speak with her privately, Mr. Harwick insisted on remaining present, stating that he and his wife maintained no secrets from one another." The Reverend's diary continues with more disturbing observations. "I was shown the chapel, a handsome structure well maintained. Mr. Harwick was particularly eager to show me his study area in the vestry, where he claimed to maintain detailed records of plantation management and agricultural experiments. I noted an extensive collection of journals, all in what appeared to be Mrs. Harwick's hand. The room possessed an atmosphere I found distinctly oppressive, though I could not identify any specific cause for this impression. When I suggested that I might return to conduct services for the enslaved population, Mr. Harwick thanked me for my concern, but stated that he preferred to maintain direct spiritual oversight of all souls under his authority. Reverend Wickham's concerns, while genuine, led to no immediate action. The autonomy of plantation masters within their own domains was virtually absolute, and without specific evidence of criminal activity, ecclesiastical authorities had limited grounds for intervention. The Reverend did, however, make inquiries among other plantation owners in the region, asking if anyone had noted unusual circumstances at Meridian Oaks. These inquiries reached Dr. Marcus Ashton, a physician who maintained a practice in Savannah but made regular circuits to plantations within a 30-mile radius. Dr. Ashton's medical journals, donated to the Medical College of Georgia in 1879, include references to visits to Meridian Oaks in 1837 and 1838. In an entry dated November 1837, he wrote, "Called to Meridian Oaks to attend to Mrs. Harwick, who was reported to be suffering from nervous exhaustion and insomnia of several weeks' duration. Found the lady in a state of considerable distress, though she was reluctant to discuss the specific nature of her troubles. She exhibited trembling of the hands and a quality of vigilance that suggested prolonged exposure to some source of anxiety. When I suggested that a period of rest away from the plantation might prove beneficial, Mr. Harwick rejected this recommendation with surprising vehemence, stating that his wife's duties were essential to his work and could not be interrupted." Dr. Ashton's journal continues with observations that take on greater significance in light of later revelations. "In examining Mrs. Harwick, I noted that her hands, while trembling, showed signs of extensive writing activity, with a callus on the right middle finger more pronounced than typically seen even in those who maintain regular correspondence. When I commented on this, she became visibly agitated, and Mr. Harwick intervened to explain that she assisted him in maintaining detailed plantation records. Most unusually, Mr. Harwick remained present throughout my examination, a breach of normal propriety that I found both inappropriate and concerning. The physician made one additional note that would prove prophetic. I attempted to engage Mr. Harwick in conversation about his background and education, as his manner of speaking suggested significant formal training. He became evasive when I inquired about his studies, mentioning only that he had pursued various philosophical and scientific subjects in Europe before his time in the Caribbean. When I asked specifically about his interest in mental philosophy, his eyes took on a quality of intense animation, and he spoke at length about the importance of understanding the mechanisms by which the human mind could be systematically altered and even destroyed. The passion with which he addressed this subject struck me as exceeding the bounds of normal intellectual interest. By early 1838, the nature of activities in the chapel vestry had evolved beyond psychological torment into territory that Catherine's journals could barely bring themselves to describe, even within their enforced clinical framework. Augustus had progressed to experiments involving sustained sensory deprivation, calculated applications of pain, and systematic attempts to induce what he termed complete psychological dissolution in his subjects. Catherine was required to document everything: the duration of each session, the specific methods employed, the verbal and physical responses, the point at which consciousness was lost, the time required for recovery. A journal entry from February 1838, written in Catherine's increasingly shaky hand, describes what Augustus called Experiment 47. The clinical language cannot entirely obscure the horror of what transpired. Catherine recorded that a subject, identified only as number 23, female, approximately 19 years of age, was subjected to a procedure Augustus claimed would demonstrate the timeline of psychological resistance. The entry describes over 6 hours of sustained mental torture, with Catherine noting specific observations every 15 minutes, as her husband employed various techniques designed to break down the subject's sense of self. What makes the journals so particularly disturbing is the evidence they provide of Augustus's evolving methodology and Catherine's own psychological deterioration. As the months progressed, Augustus began to incorporate elements of religious imagery and language into his experiments, conducting what he termed theological studies into the breaking point of faith. He would force subjects to participate in blasphemous rituals, while Catherine documented their resistance and eventual compliance. He delivered sermons of his own composition that twisted biblical scripture into justifications for his actions, all while Catherine transcribed his words with mechanical precision. The journals reveal that by mid-1838, Augustus had begun to view his wife not merely as his scribe, but as a subject in her own extended experiment. He made frequent notations, which Catherine was required to record, about her own psychological state, her diminishing resistance to the horror she witnessed, the precise stages of her transformation from reluctant participant to deadened instrument. In a particularly chilling entry from May 1838, Catherine recorded Augustus's observation that she had achieved what he termed a state of useful dissociation, able to maintain perfect documentary clarity while witnessing acts that would have rendered most persons incapable of coherent function. The children of the marriage, 2 daughters born in 1836 and 1837, were initially kept separate from their father's activities. However, Catherine's journals from summer 1838 indicate that Augustus had begun to discuss incorporating the children into his studies, not as subjects, but as observers, arguing that early exposure to the realities of human nature would prepare them for roles as witnesses to his work. This threat appears to have pushed Catherine toward the first genuine resistance she had shown since the beginning of her forced participation. A journal entry from July 1838, notably written in a hand that deviates from Catherine's usual controlled script, includes a brief personal notation that breaks the clinical tone. I cannot permit what he proposes. God forgive me for what I have already allowed, but I cannot permit this. This entry was apparently discovered by Augustus, as the following page contains his own writing, stating that Catherine had experienced a temporary lapse in her scientific objectivity, but had been reminded of the consequences of such lapses. The situation at Meridian Oaks reached its crisis point in August 1838, though the exact sequence of events remained subject to interpretation based on conflicting testimony and documentary evidence. What is established beyond dispute is that on the evening of August 23, 1838, a fire broke out in the chapel at Meridian Oaks. The blaze consumed the structure entirely, reducing it to a shell of tabby walls and scattered timbers. Inside the ruins, investigators found the remains of Augustus Nathaniel Harwick. The official report filed by Sheriff Thomas Barnwell of Chatham County describes the scene in detail. The sheriff's investigation began the morning of August 24th, when neighbors reported seeing the fire and smoke the previous evening. Sheriff Barnwell's report, preserved in the Chatham County records, states, "Upon arrival at Meridian Oaks Plantation, I found the chapel structure destroyed by fire. The main timbers had collapsed inward, and the intensity of the blaze had been sufficient to crack several of the tabby walls. In the area that servants indicated was the rear vestry, I discovered human remains burned beyond recognition, but identified by Mrs. Harwick as those of her husband, Augustus Harwick, based on a gold ring bearing the family crest that survived the fire." The report continues with observations that immediately raised questions about the fire's origin. The pattern of burning suggested that the fire began in the vestry area and spread rapidly through the structure. Multiple witnesses from the enslaved population reported seeing Mr. Harwick enter the chapel alone at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening. Mrs. Harwick stated that this was her husband's customary time for private study and devotion. She reported that she observed the fire from the main house at approximately 10 o'clock and immediately sent servants to investigate. But the blaze was too advanced to permit rescue. More troubling elements emerged as Sheriff Barnwell's investigation proceeded. In examining the remains of the vestry, I found evidence of the large writing desk mentioned by Mrs. Harwick, partially preserved due to its substantial construction. In and around this desk, I discovered numerous journals, many damaged by fire and water, but dozens remaining at least partially legible. Mrs. Harwick explained that these represented her husband's plantation records and his scientific observations on agricultural matters. Upon initial examination, I found this explanation inadequate to account for the disturbing nature of the content I was able to discern. The sheriff made the decision to remove all surviving journals and documents from the scene for further examination. This decision, perhaps more than any other factor, ensured that the truth of what had transpired at Meridian Oaks would eventually be revealed. The journals were transported to Savannah and placed in the custody of the district attorney, where they remained sealed for nearly 3 years while various legal and political considerations delayed formal proceedings. Catherine's testimony regarding the fire itself was consistent, but peculiarly devoid of emotion. According to the sheriff's report, she stated that Augustus had gone to the chapel after supper to continue his work, a routine that had been established over many months. She claimed to have been occupied with the children in the main house and noticed nothing unusual until she saw the fire's glow from an upstairs window. Her explanation for why no one had heard her husband cry out or attempt to escape was that he sometimes locked himself in the vestry while working, preferring absolute privacy for his most concentrated studies. Several members of the enslaved population were questioned separately, and their accounts introduced additional ambiguities. An enslaved woman named Patience, who served as head of the household staff, testified that she had seen Mrs. Harwick moving about the main house normally throughout the evening and had not observed anything unusual in her behavior or manner. However, a field hand named Samuel, who had been working near the chapel earlier that evening, reported seeing Mrs. Harwick near the chapel building at around 9:30, which contradicted Catherine's statement that she had not left the main house. The most significant testimony came from an enslaved carpenter named Isaiah, who had been responsible for various repairs and modifications to the chapel over the previous year. Isaiah's statement, recorded in unusual detail in the sheriff's notes, described being summoned by Mrs. Harwick to her sitting room on the morning after the fire. According to Isaiah, Catherine had handed him a leather document case and instructed him to take it to Reverend Wickham in Savannah with a letter she had written. The document case, Isaiah testified, was extremely heavy and contained what felt like books or journals. When Reverend Wickham received this package from Isaiah on August 25th, he immediately recognized its significance. The case contained 12 journals in Catherine's hand, deliberately selected from the larger collection and apparently removed from the chapel before the fire. Wickham's diary entry from that date records, "I have received from Meridian Oaks a collection of documents that have left me unable to sleep or pray with any peace." What Mrs. Harwick has recorded at her husband's insistence represents a catalog of human cruelty and depravity beyond my capacity to fully comprehend. I am convinced that this material must be brought before proper authorities. Yet I am equally convinced that its full contents cannot be made public without causing injury to innocence and potentially inciting violence that would compound the existing horrors. Reverend Wickham faced an extraordinary dilemma. The journals provided detailed evidence of systematic torture and abuse of enslaved persons, activities that, while morally abhorrent, existed in a legal gray area within the slave codes of Georgia. A plantation owner's authority over enslaved persons was nearly absolute, and prosecuting such cases was extraordinarily difficult, particularly when the alleged perpetrator was already dead. Furthermore, the journals implicated Catherine not merely as a witness, but as a participant, however coerced, in documenting and thus enabling her husband's actions. The Reverend consulted with Bishop Nathaniel Bowen of the Episcopal Diocese of Georgia and with several trusted legal minds in Savannah. The decision was made to present the material to a grand jury, but to do so in a manner that would protect certain details from public consumption. A grand jury was convened in November 1838, and Catherine was called to provide testimony. The transcript of her testimony, portions of which were published in the Savannah Republican in March 1841, provides the most direct account we have of her experience. Catherine testified that she had been compelled to serve as her husband's scribe beginning in March 1837, that her initial resistance had been overcome through threats to her family and psychological manipulation, and that the activities she was forced to document had progressed from psychological studies to acts of deliberate cruelty. When questioned about why she had not sought help earlier, she stated that her husband had convinced her that her documentation served as a protective function, restraining his impulses, and that any attempt to reveal his activities would result in far worse consequences for his subjects. The grand jury transcript includes exchanges that illuminate the complexity of Catherine's situation. When asked by the prosecutor why she had not simply refused to write, Catherine responded, "You cannot understand what it is to live in the presence of such a mind for hour after hour, day after day. He could make the irrational seem rational, the immoral seem necessary. He convinced me that by recording with precision, I was creating evidence that would ultimately bring him to justice, that my role was a form of moral witness rather than complicity. I believed this because I needed to believe it to survive what I was seeing." More troubling still was Catherine's testimony regarding the night of the fire. When directly asked if she had set the fire that killed her husband, Catherine responded, "I have considered that question every hour since that night, and I cannot answer it with certainty. I know that I went to the chapel that evening. I know that I carried with me certain journals that I could not permit to remain. I know that when I left the chapel, my husband was at his desk, writing his own observations by lamplight. I know that less than an hour later, the chapel was burning. Whether the lamp fell by accident, whether my husband in his distraction knocked it over, whether some intervention of Providence occurred, or whether my own hand acted in a moment I cannot now recall, I cannot say with certainty. This testimony, remarkable for its ambiguity, left the grand jury in an impossible position. The evidence suggested possible culpability, but fell far short of establishing clear grounds for prosecution. Furthermore, the political and social complications of a murder trial involving a widow of Catherine's class, centered on her husband's abuse of enslaved persons, presented challenges that authorities were reluctant to face. In December 1838, the grand jury issued its finding, determining that Augustus Harwick had died in an accidental fire while engaged in activities that, while morally reprehensible, did not clearly violate Georgia law as it existed at that time. No charges were brought against Catherine Meridian Harwick. The disposition of the journals themselves became a matter of extended debate. The complete collection was deemed too dangerous for public release, yet too significant to destroy. A committee comprising Bishop Bowen, Reverend Wickham, the president of the Georgia Medical Society, and 2 professors from the College of New Jersey was formed to examine the documents and determine their fate. This committee worked throughout 1839 and 1840, producing a confidential report that was delivered to the governor of Georgia and the Episcopal Church authorities. The committee's report, declassified in 1923 and now held at the Georgia State Archives, describes the journals as representing the most systematic documentation of psychological torture ever compiled. The report notes that Augustus Harwick's methods displayed knowledge of techniques that had no clear antecedent in published Western literature, suggesting either direct experience with similar practices or access to suppressed or esoteric texts. The committee observed that the progression of experiments followed a logical development, each building on observations from the previous, indicating a genuinely scientific approach applied to fundamentally evil purposes. Particularly disturbing to the committee was evidence in the later journals that Augustus had been developing a theoretical framework to justify his actions, arguing that the enslaved population represented ideal subjects for studying human mental dissolution because their legal status permitted sustained observation impossible in other contexts. He had written extensively about plans to publish his findings, believing they would revolutionize understanding of human psychology and establish him as a pioneer in mental science. The committee recommended that the journals be sealed and placed in the custody of the Episcopal Diocese, accessible only to qualified researchers with explicit authorization from church and state authorities. The majority of the journals, 51 volumes, were sealed accordingly. The 12 volumes that Catherine had removed before the fire remained with Reverend Wickham and were eventually donated to the South Carolina Historical Society with the stipulation that they not be opened until 1888, 50 years after the events they described. Catherine Meridian Harwick's own fate following the grand jury proceedings reflects the complex social dynamics of the antebellum South. She could not remain at Meridian Oaks, where her presence had become an impossible reminder of recent events. The plantation was placed under the management of a trust and eventually sold in 1842. Catherine removed to Charleston with her 2 daughters, living in modest circumstances supported by the eventual sale of the property and by the charity of her family's connections. Her remaining years were marked by profound withdrawal from society. A letter from Catherine's sister, dated April 1842, describes visiting Catherine and finding her engaged constantly in writing, filling journal after journal with what appeared to be transcriptions from memory of things she had been forced to document. The sister wrote, "She says she cannot stop writing, that her hand moves of its own volition, that she must record everything, or she will lose her mind completely. The physicians say this is a form of hysteria brought on by her ordeal, but they can suggest no effective treatment. She writes, and when I ask what she is writing, she says she is creating a complete record so that someday someone will understand exactly what occurred and exactly what she was forced to witness." Catherine died in 1847 at the age of 35, officially of consumption, though her sister's correspondence suggests a deeper wasting away of the will to live. Her journals from the Charleston years, over 100 volumes, were burned at her instruction before her death, with the exception of 1 volume that somehow survived and was discovered in 1891 during renovation of a Charleston townhouse. This single surviving journal from Catherine's final years, now held at the College of Charleston, consists largely of repetitive phrases: "I was forced to see," "I was forced to write," "I was forced to remember," written hundreds of times across the pages, occasionally interrupted by fragmentary descriptions of specific events from the Meridian Oaks Chapel. The site of Meridian Oaks Plantation itself underwent various transformations in the decades following 1838. The main house was destroyed during Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864, and the property was subdivided during Reconstruction. The chapel ruins remained standing, a shell of tabby walls, slowly being reclaimed by the coastal Georgia wilderness. Local residents avoided the area, and stories began to circulate about strange occurrences near the chapel site, unexplained lights visible at night, sounds of writing, the smell of smoke when no fire burned. In 1889, a group of researchers from Johns Hopkins University, investigating reports of the sealed journals, obtained permission to visit the former plantation site and conduct interviews with elderly residents who might recall the events of 1838. Professor Edmund Ashworth, who led this expedition, published his findings in the American Journal of Psychology in 1891. His article, titled "A Study in Documented Depravity, the Meridian Oaks Case and Questions of Enforced Moral Witnessing," brought renewed attention to the case. Professor Ashworth's research team located several individuals who had been enslaved at Meridian Oaks in 1838 and were still living in the area. Their testimony, recorded more than 50 years after the events, provided crucial perspectives missing from the official records. An elderly woman named Patience Freeman, identified as the same Patience who had testified to Sheriff Barnwell in 1838, was interviewed extensively. According to Ashworth's notes, Mrs. Freeman stated, "We all knew something terrible was happening in that chapel. People would be taken there and come back changed, like something had been broken inside them that could never be fixed. Some people never came back at all. Mrs. Catherine, she was trapped just like we were, maybe worse because she had to write it all down. I saw her hands shake so bad she could barely hold a pen, but still she had to write. Near the end, before the fire, I saw her in the main house crying and writing at the same time, like her hand wouldn't stop, even though her heart was breaking." Most significant in Patience Freeman's testimony was her account of the fire itself. "I was in the main house that night, tending to the children. Mrs. Catherine was moving through the rooms like a ghost, very quiet, very calm, not like herself. About 9 o'clock, she put on a shawl and said she needed to retrieve something from the chapel. She was gone maybe 30 minutes, maybe more. When she came back, she was carrying a case of books, and she gave them to Isaiah to take to the Reverend in Savannah. Then she went upstairs with the children. Not more than an hour later, we saw the fire. Mrs. Catherine came down, and she looked at that fire burning, and I swear to you, there was something in her face that wasn't grief and wasn't fear. It was something like relief, like watching a prison burn with the jailer inside." Other testimony gathered by Professor Ashworth added layers to the story. A man named Thomas Grant, who had been a young field hand in 1838, described seeing Augustus Harwick moving between the main house and the chapel at all hours, carrying books and strange implements. Grant stated, "Mr. Harwick, he wasn't right in his mind, not in any way a person should be. He looked at people like we were just things to study, no different than bugs or animals. And Mrs. Catherine, you could see her dying a little bit every day, getting paler and quieter, like she was fading away from being made to see what she had to see. Professor Ashworth's article raised important questions about the psychological mechanisms of enforced complicity and the long-term effects of being compelled to document atrocity. He argued that Catherine's case represented an extreme form of what he termed testimonial trauma, where the act of recording horror became inseparable from the horror itself. Ashworth noted that the medical and psychological literature of the period provided no framework for understanding or treating such conditions, leaving victims like Catherine without any possibility of genuine recovery. The article also addressed the question that had haunted discussions of the case since 1838. Did Catherine deliberately set the fire that killed her husband? Professor Ashworth examined the available evidence and concluded that absolute certainty was impossible. He noted that Catherine's own testimony suggested a dissociative state, a psychological mechanism that might have allowed her to act while maintaining conscious deniability. He wrote, "Whether Mrs. Harwick's hand struck the match or merely failed to prevent an accident she foresaw makes little difference to the moral calculus. She had been transformed by her husband's actions into an instrument of his will, and when that instrument finally broke, the consequences were perhaps inevitable." The sealed journals themselves became accessible to researchers beginning in 1888, when the 50-year restriction expired. Scholars who examined these documents reported being profoundly disturbed by their contents. A review published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 1901 described the journals as almost unreadable despite their clinical language, noting that the systematic nature of the documented abuse made it more rather than less horrifying. The reviewer wrote, "One cannot escape the conclusion that these documents represent an attempt to apply rational scientific methodology to activities that exist beyond the boundaries of human morality. The fact that this methodology was carried out through the forced labor of Mr. Harwick's wife adds an additional dimension of psychological horror." Subsequent researchers have debated whether Augustus Harwick's activities represented a form of psychological research that anticipated later developments in behaviorism and experimental psychology, or whether he was simply a sadistic individual who used the language of science to legitimize his impulses. The consensus among modern historians is that while Harwick possessed genuine intellectual sophistication and his methods showed systematic development, his purposes were fundamentally pathological rather than scientific. The question of Catherine's moral culpability has generated equally complex debate. Some scholars argue that her situation represents an extreme case of coercion that eliminates moral responsibility for her documentation activities. Others maintain that even under duress, she retained sufficient agency that her continued participation, particularly after the first year, constitutes a form of complicity. A third perspective, perhaps most persuasive, suggests that attempting to apply conventional moral categories to Catherine's situation is inadequate, that her case represents a psychological condition so extreme that it defies normal frameworks of judgment. In 1934, a research team from the University of Georgia conducted an archaeological survey of the former Meridian Oak site, including excavation of the chapel ruins. Their findings, published in the Georgia Historical Quarterly, revealed that the vestry room had indeed been modified in the ways described in historical documents, with iron rings set into the tabby walls and evidence of the specialized writing desk. Most significantly, the excavation uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the vestry floor, accessed through a trapdoor that had survived the fire in damaged but recognizable form. Inside this compartment, researchers found the remains of additional journals and documents, too damaged by water and time to be fully preserved, but sufficient to indicate that Augustus Harwick had maintained a second, even more secretive level of documentation. Chemical analysis of residues on metal fragments found in the compartment suggested the presence of substances that had no clear legitimate purpose, possibly drugs or compounds used in his experiments. The excavation report noted that evidence suggested this compartment had been accessed shortly before the fire, with journals apparently removed, though whether this removal was performed by Augustus or Catherine remains unknown. The archaeological team also documented something unexpected. In the floor of the chapel's main worship area, they discovered extensive scratching marks in the tabby surface, hundreds of small marks that appeared to have been made with fingernails or similar implements. Analysis of these marks revealed that they formed letters and words, fragmentary messages scratched into the floor by persons unknown. Many of the legible words were prayers or pleas for deliverance. The research team hypothesized that these marks had been made by individuals brought to the chapel and left waiting in the worship area before being taken into the vestry, attempting to leave some record of their presence or to invoke divine protection. One particular discovery from the excavation merits special attention. Near the altar area, the team found a small metal box that had survived the fire due to its burial beneath a collapsed timber. Inside this box was a lock of dark hair bound with ribbon and a folded piece of paper. The paper, when carefully conserved and examined, proved to be a letter in Catherine's handwriting, dated August 1838, but with no specific day indicated. The letter read, "To whoever discovers this, I must testify that I have witnessed things that should not exist in a world governed by a just God. I have been made an instrument of evil through the recording of evil, and I can no longer bear the weight of this knowledge. If you are reading this, perhaps the situation has resolved itself through providence or through my own hand. Judge me as you must, but know that I was not strong enough to stop what I was forced to see and record. May God have mercy on all the souls who suffered in this place, and may this building be consumed by fire so that its memories are cleansed from the earth." This letter, discovered in 1934 but not published until 1967 due to its sensitive nature, provides perhaps the clearest indication that Catherine had contemplated or planned the destruction of the chapel. Whether the letter represents a genuine prayer for divine intervention or a rationalization for premeditated action remains subject to interpretation. In the decades since the archaeological excavation, the former Meridian Oak site has been largely left to nature. The property changed hands several times in the mid-20th century, with various plans for development ultimately abandoned. Local residents continued to report unusual experiences near the chapel ruins, though these reports likely reflect the power of the location's history on the imagination rather than any genuine supernatural phenomena. The most recent scholarly examination of the Meridian Oaks case came in 2007, when Professor Helena Martindale of Emory University published a comprehensive analysis titled "Documenting Darkness, Enforced Testimony, and Psychological Trauma in Antebellum, Georgia." Professor Martindale argued that Catherine's case illuminated the intersection of several forms of oppression operating simultaneously. The absolute power of husbands over wives under coverture laws, the absolute power of enslavers over the enslaved, and the power of intellectual authority to override moral intuition through systematic argument. Professor Martindale's research included examination of the surviving journals using modern forensic techniques. Analysis of the handwriting revealed progressive deterioration in Catherine's script over the 3-year period, with increasing evidence of tremor and decreased control. More interestingly, forensic examination revealed numerous instances where Catherine had written words or phrases, then covered them so carefully with overwriting that they were invisible to the naked eye, but detectable under specialized imaging. These hidden texts included personal prayers, expressions of horror, and occasional direct pleas that someone would someday read these documents and understand what had truly occurred. One particular hidden text, written over the clinical description of an experiment in July 1838, reads, "God forgive me, I am writing words that should never exist. Every letter I form makes me more guilty. I can no longer tell if I am recording these events or causing them through my recording. My hand has become his hand, my eyes his eyes. When I close my eyes to sleep, I see only the words I have written during the day, endless lines of horror in my own handwriting. I am becoming my testimony, and there will be nothing left of who I was." The question that continues to haunt researchers and readers of this case is whether Catherine's act of removing certain journals before the fire and sending them to Reverend Wickham represented an attempt at justice or merely a continuation of her role as documentarian. Some argue that by ensuring these records survived, Catherine performed a final act of moral witnessing, creating evidence that would eventually force acknowledgement of what had occurred. Others suggest that her inability to simply destroy all the journals demonstrates how completely she had internalized her husband's insistence on comprehensive documentation, that even in rebellion, she remained trapped by the psychological structure he had imposed. The journals that Catherine removed before the fire, now available to researchers at the South Carolina Historical Society, differ in subtle but significant ways from those found in the chapel ruins. They are more complete, more carefully organized, and include marginalia in Catherine's hand that do not appear in the other volumes. These marginalia, written in tiny script along the edges of pages, sometimes offer interpretive context or factual corrections to Augustus's stated observations. Occasionally, they include direct condemnations, small phrases like, "This is evil," or "He lies," or "I cannot bear this." Modern trauma psychologists who have examined Catherine's case suggest that these marginalia represented a form of psychological resistance, an attempt to maintain a separate self, distinct from the recording function she was forced to perform. By secretly inserting her own judgment and testimony into the documents, Catherine created a hidden record within the official record, a testimony to her own continued existence as a moral being despite the role she was compelled to play. The broader significance of the Meridian Oaks case extends beyond its particular horror to raise questions about the nature of witnessing, documentation, and complicity in atrocity. In an era increasingly concerned with the preservation of testimony from victims of systematic abuse and violence, Catherine's situation presents a troubling counterpoint. What happens when the act of documentation itself becomes a tool of oppression? What psychological mechanisms allow or prevent individuals from maintaining moral clarity while recording horror? How do we judge those who were forced to bear witness and found themselves unable to stop what they witnessed? These questions have no simple answers. The Meridian Oaks case exists in a space of profound moral ambiguity, where conventional categories of victim and perpetrator, resistance and complicity, become inadequate. Catherine was undeniably a victim of her husband's psychological manipulation and the legal structures that gave him absolute authority over her. Yet she also occupied a role that, however involuntary, made possible the systematic nature of his actions. The journals could not have existed without her precise documentation, and without those journals, we might have no record of what occurred. To this day, researchers who examine the Meridian Oaks documents report being profoundly affected by the experience. There is something uniquely disturbing about reading Atrocity in the beautiful copperplate hand of a woman who wrote under duress, about seeing clinical precision applied to descriptions of calculated cruelty, about recognizing in the progressive deterioration of handwriting the visual manifestation of psychological collapse. The documents force readers to confront their own role as witnesses to documented horror, creating an uncomfortable parallel to Catherine's own forced witnessing. The chapel site itself remains a place of strange resonance. The tabby walls, still standing in partial form, are gradually being consumed by coastal vegetation. Live oaks have grown through what was once the worship area, their roots breaking apart the floor where desperate prayers were scratched into concrete. The vestry space, once the location of such concentrated evil, is now open to the sky, its interior walls marked by stains that might be fire damage or might be water staining, but that seem in certain light to suggest shapes and patterns that the imagination insists are meaningful. Local historians occasionally lead tours to the site, though these tours must navigate the difficult balance between historical education and sensationalism. The story of what happened at Meridian Oaks cannot be told without acknowledging both the systematic abuse of enslaved persons and the psychological destruction of Catherine herself. It is a story that resists simplification, that demands we hold multiple uncomfortable truths simultaneously in our awareness. In the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, the University of Georgia, the South Carolina Historical Society, and several other institutions, the documents of the Meridian Oaks case remain available to qualified researchers. The journals continue to be studied, not because they offer pleasant reading or because they provide clear answers, but because they represent a form of testimony that demands acknowledgement. Catherine's forced documentation created a record that survives as evidence, as warning, and as a monument to the human cost of bearing witness to evil. The final assessment of the Meridian Oaks case must remain, like so many elements of the story itself, suspended in ambiguity. We cannot know with certainty whether Catherine set the fire that killed her husband. We cannot fully judge her complicity in the documentation of his activities. We cannot determine whether her preservation of some journals while allowing others to burn represented courage, calculation, or merely the continuation of a psychological pattern she could no longer escape. What we can acknowledge is that the case reveals the terrible complexity of situations where moral frameworks collide, where legal structures enable evil, and where the very act of creating evidence becomes a form of trauma. The question that haunts every researcher who examines this case is ultimately a personal one. What would I have done in Catherine's situation? How would I have resisted or failed to resist? At what point would I have chosen to act? And what form would that action have taken? These questions have no comfortable answers because they force us to confront the limits of our own moral certainty and the terrible possibility that, placed in sufficiently extreme circumstances, we might find ourselves capable of bearing witness to horror while being unable or unwilling to stop it. The story of the plantation master who forced his wife to record his atrocities in the chapel ends not with resolution, but with continued questioning. The journals exist. The testimony survives. The ruins remain. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all that documented horror lies a truth about human nature, about power and complicity, about witnessing and recording, that we have not yet fully confronted or understood. Perhaps we never will. Perhaps the most honest response to the Meridian Oaks case is not explanation, but acknowledgement, recognition that some stories resist closure because the questions they raise are too fundamental and too disturbing to allow for comfortable answers.